Welcome to tonight's Weinstein Author Series program with Abrams Locklear and her book, Appalachian on the Table, Representing Mountain Food and People. My name is Scott Dodson. I'm the Executive Director of the Library of Virginia Foundation. So thank you so much for coming tonight. It's a great crowd tonight. This is awesome. I was worried that the 150-degree weather would keep people away, so thank you for coming. Just a couple housekeeping notes before we begin. Those of you that have heard all of this before, I apologize, but it's part of my job. Today's program was made possible through the generous support through the Carole Weinstein Endowment for Virginia Authors. We are very grateful for Carole and Marcus and their support of the library. They are not with us here tonight, but please join me in thanking them. If you would like to support the library's work, you can visit the information table out in front as you came in, or you can go to lva.virginia.gov/donate. We would appreciate your support as well. There will be a book signing after today's program in the lobby, and we are selling copies of the book in the Virginia shop, so I encourage you, if you haven't already purchased your copy, we have plenty available tonight for the signing and for you to read, so thank you in advance for that. Our next Weinstein Author Series event will take place here on August 2nd with Kadeta Williams discussing her book, I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction. So we don't usually have two Weinstein talks so close together, but we hope you can make it back again next week because that's really going to be a great talk as well. With that, let me introduce tonight's author. Abrams Locklear is a professor of English and the Thomas Howerton Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, where her research interests include Appalachia, foodways, the South, literacy, and gendered issues within each of these categories. She is the author of Appalachia on the Table, Representing Mountain Food and People, and Negotiating a Perilous Empowerment, Appalachian Women's Literacies. She is a seventh-generation Western North Carolinian, that's a hard one, who loves good food, books, and conversation. And with that, please let me welcome Abrams Locklear to the podium. So thank you all so much.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. I have a list of thanks that I need to extend briefly. I'm just really honored to be here and happy to be here with you. So a big thanks to Scott Dodson. Thank you for that beautiful introduction and for having me. Thank you to Carole Weinstein for endowing this series and her family. Thank you to Elizabeth Klaczynski, who contacted me about this event and helped set it up. Thank you to Catherine Fitzgerald Wyatt, Ashley Ramey, who was so kind to welcome me when I came in today, Annie Ray Carlton, who made my hotel reservation, and Natalie Hinterleiter, and everyone here at the Library of Virginia. So I also wanted to thank all of you for being here, and my very best friend, Kirsten Squint, who drove up from Eastern North Carolina, which was really special. The University of Georgia Press, which has done, I think, a great job with this book, and I really could not be happier. And finally, Tim Barnwell, who is a photographer based in Asheville, North Carolina, who very generously gave me permission to use his photograph as the cover. So this is a photograph of a woman named Bertha Marler, and it was taken in 1983 in Madison County in Marshall, which is the county seat, and she was breaking beans and of course gave him permission to take her photograph. Tim also met me in his studio and took photographs of my grandmother's cookbook, so the photographs that you see of her cookbook are also by him. So I thought to get us started, I would read just a little bit from the introduction of the book to kind of set things up, and then we will get into the talk. I'll also let you know that this is not a very formal scholarly lecture. I hope that's okay, because that's what I've got. All right. My maternal grandmother kept everything, from disposable pie pans repurposed as cat food bowls, to balls of yellowed aluminum foil that cracked apart in your hand, to a dusty seashell knick-knack on permanent display from a beach trip long since taken, she was not one to throw things away. She even kept her wood cook stove after purchasing an electric one. Both still occupy her kitchen in an appliance standoff of old versus new. This inclination makes sense. Born in 1915, she was a teenager during the Great Depression. Though her family fared well overall, during those years and for many after, she learned to save things that might later prove useful. When she passed away in 1996, she left behind a house full of treasures mixed with all the things she, quote, might need someday. Rather than cleaning out the house then, my bachelor uncle continued to occupy it in his other home just down the road. When he passed away in 2014, my mother and her sister finally started the long, arduous process of sorting through the things that had been accumulating since 1946, when my grandparents moved into the house. Going through all of my grandmother's things is a job that will probably never be completed, but my mother keeps trying. By the summer of 2016, I had started working on this project. That's a hint about how long this book took. And after one of her exhausting cleaning sprees, my mother called to tell me that she had found something I might be interested in seeing. As she often does, she began by listing all the reasons I might not really want to see the mystery object. It was old, it was dirty, it was in poor condition, it must have been stored in the smokehouse for a number of years because mice had nibbled its pages, and surely I would not be interested in such a bedraggled thing. After a long list of why nots, she finally told me that she had found a cookbook my grandmother made. My initial reaction, is the reason I believe Appalachia on the Table and many more books like it need to be written. I was surprised. My grandmother, Bernice Ramsey Robinson, was an avid reader her entire adult life until macular degeneration rendered her favorite pastime impossible. And she was one of the most intellectually curious people I've ever known. She was also creative, sewing beautiful, colorful quilts that she passed on to various family members. She kept her French textbooks from college and could still recite poetry she had memorized decades earlier. So I was not surprised that she made her own cookbook with a photograph album cut to size for the cover and black string to hold it together. Nor was I surprised that the cookbook adhered to genre conventions. It even has a section for home remedies and health tips in the back, complete with advice about how to relax properly by stretching. My favorite clipping offers advice for mailing fruitcakes, recommending that bakers line a box with waxed paper and bury a gaily wrapped cake in freshly popped corn, which adds a, quote, festive touch to the gift and cushions it for mailing. Even a quick flip through the cookbook reveals that my grandmother subscribed to a number of different publications, was interested in many varied approaches to cooking, and was well-versed into how to organize a cookbook to resemble one that had been published by a press. What surprised me were the recipes. Of course, I had heard about my grandmother's cooking from my mother, though I never experienced her homemade meals. By the time I came along, she was crooked over with osteoporosis and relied on convenience foods like frozen banquet fried chicken with canned biscuits and canned vegetables to feed us when we helped her set tobacco every spring. But I had heard about the fresh fried chicken, vegetables from the garden, and chocolate gravy drizzled on biscuits for dessert that appeared on the table during my mother's childhood. Maybe that's why I had written my own culinary script for my grandmother that turned out to be naive, close-minded, and downright wrong. I make my living reading, writing, and teaching about Appalachia and its people. As a seventh-generation Western North Carolinian, I am keenly aware of the hurtful and lasting impact stereotypes about mountain people have. So why was I so surprised to learn that my grandmother had not one, but two identical recipes for devil's food cake with coconut icing? Did I expect to see only recipes for so-called traditional mountain desserts like apple stack cake, apple leather, and pie made with sulfured apples? I must have. While the cookbook contains some recipes that I apparently expected to find in the southern mountains, apple dumplings, biscuits, chow chow, it also has a plethora of recipes I did not expect to see, from royal fruit dressing to date nut fondant to streusel. It also contains recipes for some creations that seem downright bizarre to imagine on South Turkey Creek, where my grandmother spent the last 50 years of her life. A handwritten recipe for grape ketchup to be eaten with fried eggs, meat, or lima beans. And my favorite, fig pickles. Figs don't really grow in western North Carolina, unless you work really hard at it. It seems as though she started the cookbook in 1936, the same year she married my grandfather. She saved a dental snuff advertising booklet with 1936 and 1937 calendars in the back, and empty pages she filled with recipes. In those pages, my grandmother wrote a recipe for tomato ketchup that instructs the reader to use a food chopper. I lingered over this detail for a long time. My grandmother, who later struggled to make ends meet while raising tobacco and 3 children, had a food chopper? I was also surprised to see so many recipes that featured product ingredients, from Bisquick to Swansdown flour to Calumet baking powder. The one that really got and still gets my attention is the very fancy recipe for blossom thyme cake that instructs, now, while your orchard is all abloom is just the time to entertain your club, give a shower, or just have a party for no other reason than that beautiful drift of pink or white, bring spring indoors by decorating a big marble cake with sugared blossoms, a centerpiece that's lovely to behold, luscious to eat, with real blossoms on top, sugar dipped for sparkle. Complicated. It's not that these recipes are unusual in the mid-20th century South, and it may be that the cookbook was more of a wish book than a guide to everyday cooking for my grandmother. I have a hard time imagining the blossom thyme cake. As foodways scholar Megan J. Elias points out, cookbooks are aspirational texts that represent desirable lifestyles and values. But I cannot stop thinking about the fact that despite my immersion in the interdisciplinary field of Appalachian studies and the burgeoning field of foodways, until finding this cookbook, I never imagined that my grandmother, whom I had always thought of as distinctly mountain in terms of cultural identity, would have saved recipes between 1936 and 1952, the last dated entry in the book, for pecan loaves, cheese twists, Baby Ruth cookies, Jiffy featherweight biscuits, or Kellogg's Krispies marshmallow squares. Why is that? Had I imagined my own romanticized version of cured ham, leather breeches, pickled watermelon, and apple stack cake, only to find that my grandmother's culinary tastes were far more varied? Had I expected her to use ingredients procured on the farm and not from the store? Moreover, how had such a powerful script come to dominate the way I imagined my grandmother's cooking without me even knowing it existed until I confronted its antithesis? What implicit judgments had I made about my grandmother based on the foods I imagined she would have been interested in cooking? Where did my Appalachian food script come from, and how have mountain residents responded to those scripts? These are the questions this book begins to answer. So 2 more things to set us up very briefly. The first is, rather than the actual foods consumed, of interest here are the representations of foods consumed, implied moral judgments associated with those foods, and how those judgments shape reader perceptions of those depicted. And then, attempting to define a specific list of foods that qualify as mountain is an impossible task. Those in search of such an authoritative list in the pages of this book will be disappointed. Although there were plenty of foods commonly associated with the region, from leather breeches, which are dried green beans, also called shuck beans or shucky beans, to ramps, which I'm sure you all know about, very popular, to pickled watermelon to apple stack cake, there are plenty of others, like fried chicken, biscuits, and casseroles, that are just as frequently associated with the South more generally. As food scholar Marcy Cohen Ferris explains, there is little point in claiming culinary exceptionalism for specific regions or people. no one group or area owns any particular food or recipe. Cultural exchange is the hallmark of ever-evolving food habits. Okay, so I've got some slides here for you, and I've tried to gear the presentation a little bit more towards information in the book about Virginia. So I hope you find that interesting, and I'm going to use the handheld mic. We'll see how this goes. Can you hear me? Yes, is that working? All right. So here's the cookbook. I know, isn't it cool? And if you flip it over, it says photo, and then this is the part that, is the last part of the photographs. It's really not in very good condition, and even less so now, because I've taken it around to a few talks, which I've stopped doing because it really is falling apart when you open it. But that's what it looks like on the outside. And then here's an example of all of the clippings, and this is the one about mailing fruitcakes that I read, which is why I put this one here. And then this one's pretty smart. The washable scarf will help you keep the collar of your expensive, or not expensive, I guess, winter coat clean. So you should have a scarf and wrap it around your neck, and it needs to be washable, and then when it gets soiled, you just wash it and preserve the collar of your coat. And then there's a tip here for making gravy. It says a baking powder can with nail holes in the lid filled with flour and placed on or near the stove is convenient for thickening gravy or making sauces. This may also be used for flouring meats and the breadboard. And that's from Imogene, and she's in Alabama. And then this image is also in the book, and I think it's a really powerful visual of what this book is about. I feel like on the left is how most of America has imagined Appalachian food, and maybe how they still imagine it today to a degree. So you've got a handwritten recipe. It's for blackberry pudding. And I love the instructions in the middle. It says, now take. Now you're going to take and do this. And at the bottom, she says, cook until thick to make a custard, put on top of cake, then top with meringue and brown, eat while warm. But it's handwritten, and it also uses ingredients, at least the primary ingredient, that presumably she would have gotten on the farm. There were plenty of blackberries there. And then most of those other things, by the time she was writing the recipe, were pantry staples. But then over here on the other side, and bananas, you'll understand why the bananas are important here in a minute. She saved a recipe, I think, from a glass baking dish. I'm assuming it was glass, and it's round, and the whole thing does, fold out, but this is how it is on the page. And when I first saw it, I thought, oh, it's pineapple upside down cake, but it's actually banana upside down cake, which I think is pretty interesting. So she had lots of product ingredients, recipes in there as well. Okay, so what I decided to do is to sort of talk through the book in order, but with a deep dive in chapter 1, because there's a lot about Virginia in chapter 1. And then a little bit of a deep dive in the conclusion, and then you'll have to read the book to get more on the in-between chapters. I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis. So the title for chapter 1 is called Fiction Made Real: Mountain Food and Local Color and Travel Writing. So I need to set this up a little bit. In Appalachian studies, most scholars agree that the idea of Appalachia as a region that was separate from or distinct from the rest of the American South really came into being in the years following the Civil War. That was sort of a Reconstruction era phenomenon, that in the years before that, what we now think of as Appalachia was just considered the frontier. It was the wilds. There was even a genre of writing called Southwestern humor, and it was not set in what we think of as the Southwest, but rather places like East Tennessee. So really since the late 1970s and then on up until now, a lot of work has been done to kind of unpack this idea of Appalachia and how did it form and when did it form and why did it form. And there's a scholar named Henry Shapiro who published a book in 1978 called Appalachia on Our Mind. And one of his central arguments is that fictional stories were really instrumental in shaping national perceptions of the Mountain South, and that travel writing also had a huge role. So if you think of the audiences of this fiction, you can imagine a contemporary example might be so-called mainstream Americans who read, for example, The New Yorker. So in this time, 1880s, early 1900s, we're talking about publications like the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, Lippincott's, pretty big readership along the eastern seaboard, especially in New England, usually an upper social, socioeconomic class, usually a certain level of formal education. And during this time, local color literature was really popular. So if you're not familiar with that term, it was fiction that was set in locations that so-called mainstream readers would find exotic, that would sort of transport them to a different place. So if you've read Kate Chopin's work set in Louisiana, that's very local color. Local color fiction was also very popular in depicting Appalachia. And there are some kind of key characteristics of this genre that include often really lush, beautiful descriptions of the landscape. So if you're talking about the mountains, a lot of these stories will talk about the blue, misty mountains and the blooming azalea and the mountain laurel and the rushing waterfalls and the chirping birds and the undulating mountains. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And it's juxtaposed with really problematic, stereotypical portrayals of the people who live there, who often speak in very heavy dialect. And if you're looking for some origins of stories that sort of trot out those very well-known stereotypes of illiteracy, degeneracy, the incestuous, lazy, illiterate, moonshining, feuding mountaineer, you can find those in spades in these stories. A lot of that was also at play in travel writing, which was meant to be read as true, but was really creative nonfiction, right? Because you take a trip, you write a story about it, and I mean, who's to say what actually happened? So, my question, lots of work has been done on everything I just said. How did those writers talk about food? And how did food function in those stories? And I want to talk about with you what I expected to find versus what I actually found. So I went into the research for this really overconfident and kind of cocky. And I read stories for about 2 years and took lots and lots of notes. And what I expected to find were offensive descriptions of food, and I found lots of them. They are definitely there, and there's a whole lot about that in the chapter. But I also found some surprises. But for the ones that were offensive, the word that kept coming up is coarse, C-O-A-R-S-E. So there was a direct parallel between the food and the people who were consuming it. So that if the people were coarse, used in that way, uncivilized, unsophisticated, uncouth, then the food that they prepared or served or consumed was also coarse, meaning unsavory, not prepared properly, lack of culinary know-how, and difficult to digest. Another word that comes up over and over these stories is dyspepsia, upset stomach. So you've got these people on trips, and they're stopping at homes, and food is offered to them, and they're so rude, and they're so judgmental, and they talk about this greasy food that they ate, grease comes up again and again, and how it gave them dyspepsia. And even before I started work on this project, it struck me that the very same food that was used to portray the so-called degenerate hillbilly in the late 1880s on into the early 1900s is the very same food that's really popular now. That's served at farm-to-table restaurants, that people are buying ramp appetizers, and sometimes it's just ramps. Like I went to a restaurant I won't name, and the server said, "Would you like to try the ramps in a bag?" And I said, "Oh, is it like a puff pastry?" He said, "No, it's a brown paper bag." And he said they've got sea salt and olive oil, and we put them in the convection oven. And I was like, oh. So here's an example of exactly what I expected to find on the left. So this is a story, an illustration published in a story by James Lane Allen. James Lane Allen was a travel writer, so think of it as creative nonfiction. And he was from Kentucky, but he was not from Appalachian Kentucky. He was from Western Kentucky, the bluegrass region. Think bluegrass, bourbon, horses, not coal country. And he really actually didn't like writing about Appalachia, but his editors liked for him to do it because they sold well. So he really only published 2 pieces that were similar to this, but he has a piece called Through Cumberland Gap on Horseback in Harper's New Monthly magazine. It came out in 1886. And the story goes, according to Allen, he was traveling. He stopped in Burnside, Kentucky, which is also where Harriet Simpson Arno, a really well-known Kentucky writer, is from. And the railway hadn't been in that area for that long, but it was. And he stopped at a fruit stand. So there was this entrepreneur who took advantage of more access to imported fruits, set up a fruit stand. The fruit stand had bananas. And Allen says that when he was there, a mountain man, see Exhibit A, shows up and sees the bananas and says, "Blame me if them ain't the darndest beans." So we're supposed to laugh, right? We're supposed to think that this mountain man is uncouth and uncivilized and kind of a buffoon and that he doesn't know what bananas are. His pants are all tattered at the bottom. Of course, he doesn't have shoes on. He's got this sort of wall-eyed, wild look in his eyes, like he's on the defensive. I don't know exactly. But I did more research because I saw this and I thought, well, how common were bananas in Kentucky at this time? I mean, it's 1886. And so what I learned is that they had only been exhibited at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in 1876. That was 10 years before. They were notoriously difficult to transport, and you had to have railway access. And so for really, in the 1880s, for most Americans, unless you lived on the coast with a major port, you didn't have access to bananas. If you lived in New Orleans, yes. If you lived in inner America and in the mountains of Kentucky, it's remarkable that they had bananas. So rather than seeing this as a sign of modernity and progressivism, he makes a joke out of it. And I was talking with Ronnie Lundy about this. She's a wonderful food writer. If you want to know more about Appalachian food, you need to read Vittles, her cookbook. It won the James Beard Award. 2 of them, I think. And she sort of leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, Erica, it could be that that mountain man was just playing Allen for the fool. That he totally knew what they were, but also knew what Allen thought of him and just decided to give him what he wanted." So I don't know which it was. We'll talk about it just a tiny bit one more time, but bananas kept coming up in my research as this kind of marker of civility. If you knew what they were, if you had access to them, and if you knew how to eat them, if you knew that the peeling was not edible, then you had this sort of place in the culinary hierarchy. And if you didn't know, then you're like this guy. Okay, so that's what I expected. Lots of examples of that. But the image on the bottom was really a surprise to me. So this writer I was not familiar with until I started this project. His name's David Hunter Strother, and he had a pen name, which is pretty fun, Port Crayon. He was also an illustrator, and he was born in what was then Virginia, but is now West Virginia, Martinsburg, in 1816 in Berkeley County. And I didn't know this about him until I started this book. Aside from George Washington Harris, he was the only writer from Southern Appalachia who had a national audience before the Civil War. And his illustrations were also really well known. So he took a trip with his wife and his daughter in 1857, and he wrote this long story called A Winter in the South that was published in several installments. And it's fiction, but it's also based on his travels with his family. And it's so clever. It's so good. It starts in Berkeley Springs at the spa, which is a real place. There's a picture in the book if you're not familiar. And he's got this character who has what? Dyspepsia. And he's gone to the spa for the cure, and there are all these newfangled things this guy's supposed to do, eat chicken gizzards and all kinds of strange things. And it makes him sick. And he's like, you know what, forget this. I'm going to go travel in these beautiful mountains. And turns out the cure for his ailment is mountain food, because everywhere he goes, he's offered this farm fresh food that's prepared well, and it sits well with him, and it's so much better. And Strother is really, really complimentary of lots of places that he visits, including East Tennessee. So this is a rendering of the interior of a cabin in East Tennessee. And you can see that it's neat and tidy. There's also food hanging, which could be peppers, but are probably beans. He writes lovingly about Jonesboro, Johnson City. He mentions East Tennessee, what's now University. And that was a surprising find to me. There are other examples, including Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park and the gardens at the Biltmore Estate. He took a trip, too, and writes some really interesting things about food in Appalachia. But the next thing I want to talk about are archival finds. So I pulled slides from places in Virginia, or what used to be Virginia. I let that slide in, too. I found so many examples in archives that really overturned that narrative of the degenerate hillbilly who eats coarse food. So one example is this one. It's from the Virginia Tech Food and Drink Collection, which is a fascinating collection of materials in Blacksburg if you're ever there or want to look at them. It's a recipe from Betty D. Kramer from 1883. And her collection is actually sort of similar to my grandmother's. She's got clippings and she's got recipes from other people. But it's a recipe that calls for lobster. And this is in the years that are barely 2 decades after the end of the Civil War. So I found that really remarkable. That it exists, that is handwritten. It seems like it's something that she was making and written by this woman, Mrs. Gallagher. And then the one on the right I put in there because I think it indicates that Miss Betty D. Kramer was aware of nutritional advice, and she cared about what people recommended that she ate. And it's also really strange, funny kind of advice. The following information may be useful to some at this season of the year, if not new to many. Spinach has a direct effect upon the kidneys. And then it goes through. So I thought you would be interested in that. And we'll get to digestibility in just a minute. But this one on the bottom says, a soup made from onions is regarded by the French as an excellent restorative in debility of the digestive organs. So another thing I learned is at the turn of the 20th century, nutrition was really, really poorly understood. And it took scientists and nutritionists a really long time to understand pellagra and to understand the importance of niacin and absorption of niacin in the body and what happens if you're not getting that. And instead, the focus seemed to be on digestion. So in menus especially, you'll see little call-outs to the digestibility of a certain food. People were also really worried about soda and the properties of soda, like soda bread was scary stuff. So this one I put up because I think it's so strange. I just have to talk about it a little bit. This is from the Litchfield family household ledger from the 1870s to 1890s. It's full of so many recipes that call for imported ingredients that indicate this was a very wealthy family that had access to these ingredients, that had apparently a wide collection of implements and tools and materials that, again, really overturned the dominant narrative at the time about what people in Appalachia were eating. But I saw this and I thought, now this can't be mangoes like mangoes. What is this? Oil mangoes? So I have a friend, April McGregor, who's brilliant. She preserves and cans and pickles and is in magazines all the time. And I wrote to her and was like, what is this? And she said, it's probably bell peppers. They were sometimes called mangoes during this time. And I think that's probably our best guess because it says at the top, take 40 mangoes. Cut a slice out, take out the seed, and fill them with salt. I won't read the whole thing. But it also calls for horseradish and garlic and some other ingredients, which makes the other possibility, which is pickled cantaloupe, pretty unlikely. But apparently that was also, cantaloupe are also sometimes called mangoes. And David Shields, who's a culinary historian, let me know that. And then one more example that overturns that dominant narrative. This is a dinner menu from the Grove Park Inn in Asheville, July 22nd, 1919. And I didn't realize that the Grove Park Inn was just right there with all of those spas and like the Kellogg place. I mean, it was meant to be a place of restoration and quiet and solitude. They had a strict curfew. The breakfast, one of the breakfast menus, the quality of the photo was not good, which is why I didn't put it up here, but it's got like lines about how long the oatmeal was cooked to make it more digestible. But I put this one up because in, let's see, the second item, Little Neck Clam Cocktail, a special sauce prepared for Grove Park Inn, mild in condiment and not difficult to digest. So there you are. My point in talking about these archival materials is that if you were a subscriber of Atlantic Monthly, Harper's Monthly New Magazine, the title, Lippincotts, and all you were reading were local color stories and travel narratives set in Appalachia, you would have no idea that any of this existed. You wouldn't know what the menu at the Grove Park Inn or the Hot Springs Hotel or the Berkeley Springs Inn or any of those other spas and hotels, what they were serving, and you definitely wouldn't know about the recipes that people in obviously wealthy families had. So that was chapter 1. Let me look at my notes here for just 1 second. Yeah. So my next question after this, I spent all this time in local color fiction and travel narratives. I was aware that roughly the same time, you've got progressive era initiatives going on. So progressive era reformers are deeply invested in doing work all over the country, but especially in the rural South and especially in Appalachia, setting up settlement schools to increase literacy rates, working to improve sanitation and water quality so that people are not getting typhoid fever, for example, and also teaching nutrition classes. So I thought, well, then how are the progressive era reformers writing about food? So now's when I switch into my kind of quick summary mode. That's what chapter 2 is about. The title for chapter 2 is Competing Culinary Discourses, Writing Food in Early 20th Century Appalachia. And I got really overwhelmed with this chapter because when I started doing the research, I realized that could be a whole book or several books. There were so many people doing this work. And I ended up focusing on 3 case studies. So the first is John C. Campbell and his second wife, Olive Dame Campbell. They took a trip through the mountains and recorded what they saw and then published a really well-known book about that. And then William Goodell Frost, he was president of Berea College in Kentucky for a long time, 1892 to 1920. And his wife, Nellie Marsh Frost, or Eleanor Marsh Frost. And then a really problematic figure named Thomas Robinson Dawley, who thought that the nutrition problem in Appalachia, as he called it, could be solved by mill work. And he was in favor of child labor. And even in his day, he was not popularly regarded. But what I found with all of those case studies is that the more public the writing became, the more blunted and sort of homogenized it was. So that if someone was writing to raise money for their cause, if fundraising was the impetus for the document, then it often highlighted the most dire situations found, of course, so you could appeal to donors and raise money. But once again, when I looked in archives and I looked at drafts of conference papers that were never presented or diaries of William Goodell Frost's wife, I found much more nuanced portrayals. Some really, really fascinating stuff. And so then I started thinking about, okay, so that's what progressive era folks were saying about food in the mountains. So what were writers saying in response? How is this being depicted in fiction moving forward in history? So chapter 3 moves into the 1930s, and once again, there's a lot of information, and I decided to focus on one particular program. I could talk for a long time about this one. I won't. There was a program in North Carolina called the Live at Home program, and it seems like an obvious slogan. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, where else are you going to live? So the idea was that as families moved away from agricultural, subsistence-based lifestyles and industrialization became more prominent, that they were less able to sustain themselves, especially if they were involved in cash crops. So if you're growing something that you can't eat, and you're spending all of your time growing something you can't eat, then that can become a problem, especially for people who don't own the land that they're farming. So for tenant farmers, for sharecroppers who are growing cotton, who are growing tobacco, this is an issue. So the governor of North Carolina, O. Max Gardner, comes up with this program, and it was a common slogan during the time, but he sort of took it on as his political manifesto, and issued all of this advice to families about how to live at home. You should have this much space in corn, this many, partials of an acre for tomatoes, 1 cow, 1 pig, all of these recommendations, which I can see the looks on your faces, I know. It's like, okay, well, I don't own my land, and I'm spending all of my time growing this tobacco, so I'm not sure how to make this happen, Max. And what I found is that there were these novels being written in the 1930s that were really about a mill strike, this famous mill strike in Gastonia, North Carolina, called the Lorry Mill Strike, that were deeply critical of this program and make really clear that the problem was one of capital. It was not one of know-how or desire to grow one's own food. I also found a menu for the Live at Home dinner held at the governor's mansion in 1932, and there's a picture of it in the book. It's like a farm-to-table menu. Every item, they tell you where it came from. So the black walnuts came from Madison County, North Carolina. The sauerkraut came from Watauga County, North Carolina. So moving into chapter 4, my question was, okay, we've had all this about mountain people and mountain food. What did mountain people themselves actually think? If this is what everybody else is saying about you and your food, then what's the effect? So this chapter, I admit, is kind of a downer. It's about food shaming and the idea of food stigma. So I draw from work by a French theorist named Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about this idea of cultural capital. So that capital is not just economic, it's also cultural. And an example I use when I'm teaching is kind of silly, but I think it makes the point. So in 2023, if you imagine someone who has a vast knowledge of opera, for example, what kind of social status do they have versus someone who has an equally vast knowledge of Merle Haggard? I don't know, you decide. One of Bourdieu's main points is that this capital is almost entirely dependent on time and context, so that what might elevate someone's standing in one time and place could do the opposite in another time and place. And it's exactly what's happened with Appalachian food. So that the food ramps, creasy greens, leather breeches, greasy food that was considered degenerate in the 1880s, early 1900s, is suddenly very foodie and very trendy and like what the bougie people eat. So I talk about that kind of cultural capital, and it's sort of a subset of that culinary capital, and this idea of aspirational eating. This is actually a term that folklorists use. I find it really useful, so that you might eat something that you're not familiar with or that you don't even really want to eat, just to appear of a certain class or set, or, you know, to feel like you're fitting in. And yeah, I also talk about foods that have shifted in this meaning. Ramps is a really obvious example. If you're not familiar with what they are, they're a wild onion that used to be a sign of poverty. They're a forageable. It's something you find in the wild. They smell really strong. You smell like them after you eat them. And now they're astronomically expensive, $25 a pound at Whole Foods, on menus everywhere. Sorghum syrup is the same way. We can talk about that later if you want to. That was the sweetener that you used when you couldn't get sugar, but now it's the authentic sweetener that you use when you're going to make your apple stack cake. And then to sort of, I don't know, make up for the bummer chapter, chapter 5 is about celebrating mountain food, because even years before I started this project, I remember I was living in Utah and I was on a plane coming home to see my family. So it was 2003 or 4, I don't know. And there was an article about Martha Stewart, and she was using ramps. And I was like, what is this? What is this? And I kept thinking, you know, in the literature that I had read and taught, mountain riders were celebrating food way before it was trendy to do so. And I was just sure of this. And so that's what this chapter is about. I think the earliest writer in that chapter is publishing in the 1950s. So that's sort of a happy chapter. And then let me be sure that I am on track now. Yes, okay. So where does this leave us now? Well, I brought show and tell. You can look at it if you hang around at the end if you want to. This is the April issue of Bon Appetit magazine. So it came out the same month that my book came out, which was pretty awesome. And they have a 16-page spread on Appalachian food. And it's called Appalachia Anew. And there are recipes for chicken and dumplings, apple stack cake, there's pork. I mean, all the things you would expect. So it's trendy. It's definitely trendy. And I was going to show you this too. I really wanted to show you menus, but I knew that was a copyright issue. So I didn't, but I encourage you to go to these websites and look up the menus and look at the items and read the descriptions. So this is the title of my conclusion, From Coarse to Hot, a Gentle Reminder. So we've got chefs like Sean Brock, John Fleer, Travis Milton, who are doing tremendous work. And I do want to be really clear that I think this is a good thing. Like personally, my own opinion is that it's a good thing because finally, Appalachian food's being venerated. It's being celebrated. It's delicious. It's wonderful. Like, go team. So Sean Brock he made a name for himself mostly in Charleston with a restaurant named Husk, and then lots of other restaurants too. But the Audrey restaurant, which I haven't visited yet, but I know people who have, they say it's wonderful, is in Nashville, and it's almost completely based on Appalachian foods. And the descriptions are fascinating, so you should look at that. And then, and Brock is from Appalachian, Virginia, by the way. John Fleer is from Winston-Salem, but he's been in Asheville for a long time. He made a name for himself at Blackberry Farms in Tennessee. And his restaurant, Rhubarb, is very, very locally sourced, farm to table, really highlights a lot of foods that are considered Appalachian. And then Travis Milton is also from Appalachian, Virginia. And he has a restaurant called Hickory in Bristol, Virginia. And these are some of the things that you'll find there. So sour corn butter, salt rising bread, country ham, kilt lettuce, killed lettuce. So you get fresh lettuce and you pour what? Hot grease on it. You're nodding, you know. And and some onions and maybe some hard-boiled eggs. And candy roaster squash, which is an heirloom squash that Milton in particular loves. Greasy beans, greasy not because there's a bunch of grease, although there may well be, but because when they're growing, they've got this sheen. And these are the beans that are really protein rich, have the very large beans in the pod, and that's the kind of bean that you need to make leather britches or shucky beans. The little skinny beans will not do for drying beans. And then ramps and other foraged foods. So what do we do with this? One of the questions I have here in my notes is, this is great, this is exciting, but how does this affect local people? How does this affect families who've been cooking this way for a long time? Like, what are the dangers here? There's a wonderful scholar and friend, Elizabeth Englehart, who has got an essay about Appalachian food, and she warns us that we don't want to fetishize Appalachian food in the same way that Southern food has been. You know, there's this sort of myth about Southern food that it's like the welcome table and everyone's welcome, and we know good and well that that's not true. And so she's, urging us to think about that. And I think one of the unintended consequences of magazine articles like the one I just mentioned and wonderful restaurants like this is one of accessibility. Foods served in restaurants in this capacity are often very expensive. Now you can go to a ramp festival or a ramp supper in the spring. Those are usually at community centers. Those are usually affordable. They're usually fundraisers. But that can be an issue. You also run the risk of promoting a sort of list of qualified Appalachian foods that then becomes very exclusionary and leaves out the culinary traditions of people who are in the region, and it's like that is not even counting in some way. And then if somehow there becomes that kind of narrative of the mountaineer, then you've got this really deep whitewashing problem, which is another big thread that I talk about in the book, that a lot of foods associated with Appalachia originate from people of color, and this is hardly ever recognized. Corn, for example, is often associated with cornbread, with moonshine, with lanky, hillbilly, mountaineer people, and there's not mention of indigenous people, and Shailu the Corn Mother, and the Three Sisters, corns, beans, and squash, and it goes on. So I think that's just something that we definitely need to keep in mind. And the big thing that I try to point out in the conclusion is that it's awesome that the food is being elevated, but be careful. And what's not okay is that national perceptions of mountain people are not equally elevated. I would contend that national understandings of Appalachian people are just as problematic now as they were at the turn of the century. The food is trendy, the food is cool, it's in the New York Times and the Washington Post and Bon Appetit, and yay, I'm glad. However, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of what we're saying about mountain people. So I wanted to conclude by telling you about one of my favorite writers. His name's Robert Gipe, G-I-P-E, and he kind of gives us an answer, I feel like. He's got a trilogy of books. The first one is called Trampoline, the second one is Weed Eater, the last one is Pop. They are illustrated novels. They're not graphic novels, they're illustrated novels. And I have to set this up before the next slide so this will make sense. The last one, Pop, is really a postmodern commentary on the Appalachian food scene and this sort of craze about Appalachian food. The protagonist is this young girl named Nicolette. She's having a really hard time. She lives in a community that has been ravaged by mountaintop removal. Her family has really struggled with opioid addiction, with violence, with just a lot of issues. But she loves to cook, and she's good at it. But she likes to innovate. So rather than making apple stack cake, she makes lemon poppy seed stack cake. Rather than regular mac and cheese, she puts gorgonzola in it. Her mother is kind of horrified, like, what are you doing? So it's this sort of conversation between traditional and new, kind of what's happening at these restaurants versus maybe what happened in home kitchens before. And there's this scene in the book where everyone gathers together and people bring an apple stack cake, and the mother walks in and sees it and gets so upset and throws it out on the hillside. And I wanted to read the quote because she's just done with it. I mean, she's like done with this whole like romanticizing business. And she says, I went in there and seen that cake so perfect, and I thought to myself, I don't want to see that cake on Instagram. I just want us to eat it and then us remember it. I don't want to see it online, all cropped and filtered and looking like an advertisement for something. I just want it to be cake, a cake we ate together. Gipe also spends a long time describing how to make an apple stack cake. For whatever reason, I guess because it's beautiful and it is delicious, it's become sort of the iconic food associated with Appalachia. If you Google Appalachian food, this is one of the first things that comes up. It's in like every news feature. And I worry that someone who has never made one before might think this was a common dessert. Not so. This is insanely labor intensive. And if you're truly going to make it from scratch, you grow your apples, you dry your apples, you grow your sorghum, you grind your sorghum, you have your sorghum syrup, and then finally you make your cake with all these little tedious layers. You put in the filling, you add on the syrup, and then it has to sit for days so it can be moist. This was a special occasion cake. This was maybe twice a year. This was when your favorite relative got married. This was Christmas. This was not every week. And then finally, there's a meal at the end of the book that I think really deconstructs in a useful way the idea that you have to eat certain traditional or authentic foods. The mother loves processed food, and one of her favorites is oatmeal cream pies. And she likes Pop-Tarts. She likes all kinds of things. Vienna sausages appear on the table. So they have this meal with all the traditional things. There are pinto beans, there's cornbread, I think there might be ham. I'd have to go back and look. But there's also Vienna sausages and all of these other things you might expect. And the mother, Dawn, says it looked like the prize display on Wheel of Fortune if all the prizes was food. And I put that up too because there's an essay in the Oxford American by Chris Offutt, who's from Kentucky, called Trash Food. And he talks about this very problematic trend of associating, if the food that's now popular was associated with mountain people turn of the century, that phenomenon is still at play, but the menu is rotated. So that the foods associated with mountain people in a problematic way are now processed foods or trash food. And there are actually trash food parties, believe it or not, that are meant to make fun. I know someone who went to one, who's a journalist who was writing about it. So GYPE is well aware of this and is really, I think, trying to break it down in some useful ways. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions if you have them.
All right. If you have questions, Ashley and I have the microphones on each side of the room. If you want to raise your hand, we'll come your direction. Oh. It's a race now.
Hi, thank you so much. That was very, very wonderful. And a lot of it resonated with me. My family is also from Appalachia, and I have been really disconnected from that part of my heritage for a long time. So this was a wonderful opportunity to get back in touch and hear some things that I haven't heard since I was down there below the seats. My question is, I work for a tour company out of Atlanta, and they focus on intersectional history, and they did an intersectional food history tour of the South. And one of the things that came up when our founder was doing the research for it is that a lot of the foods that we consider to be Southern aren't really Southern at all, i.e. fried green tomatoes. Anybody? Some people are looking at me like I'm crazy. You can ask me as I leave. Was there any food that you stumbled across when doing research for this project that was not Appalachian, that you had in your mind as kind of in that realm of what you would assume to be Appalachian food?
Yeah, I mean, everything is from somewhere else, right? Well, the apple stack cake is probably German in origin. The process of drying the beans, people are not quite sure who did that first, but Cherokee's a pretty good guess. And I talk about that a little bit. I mean, a lot of work has been done about that. I mean, talking about Appalachian people, that is the first Appalachian people, right? And two, I think just foods that are quintessentially Appalachian, but somehow never show up in conversations about it, which is a little different than what you asked. But I was thinking about the pepperoni roll, which is the official state food of West Virginia. And I'm not making this up. They were invented by an Italian miner to be this sort of quick, protein-rich food to eat down in the mines. And I had a student from West Virginia who, I mean, I could just see him. He gave a presentation on pepperoni rolls. First day of class, like he saw the assignment, he was like, can I please do pepperoni rolls? And he made them for us and brought them. And I guess the debate is cheese or no cheese. And it's like a thing. It's very serious.
Being from West Virginia, I have a poster of pepperoni rolls in my kitchen. There's also a debate as to whether it's sliced pepperoni or stick pepperoni, but these are very important issues.
Well, which do you prefer?
I like a sliced pepperoni roll with no cheese, but it's very regional.
Do you have a favorite gas station where you get them?
You know, I usually go to a Go-Mart, but it depends. It's wherever they're available.
There's discussion about sheets, too. I mean, this is a whole, There was a whole presentation about it at the Appalachian Food Summit.
Hi, this kind of dovetails on her question. My mama in Lenoir City, Tennessee, near where the Cherokees' mother towns were, she specialized in lots of things, but mainly in tamales. And so you were talking about pellagra and the corn, and I think it was a craze in the 30s, and I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I don't know much about the history of tamales in the South. I remember the first time I read A Streetcar Named Desire. They're in there. I was like, what's this?
They're big in New Orleans still.
Right,
yeah.
right, which is not an answer to your question at all. But no, it's something I'd like to learn more about for sure. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer.
Also, could you settle the debate on whether or not marinara sauce should be called gravy? Because I know people from Italy who call it gravy, and I thought that everybody in the South called it gravy, but sometimes I get people look at me like I'm crazy, you know.
There's a whole history there I don't know, so I'm not going to pretend I know. But in terms of Appalachia, people do say tomato gravy. I mean,
Right.
and it's thicker, and I think it's a different consistency than. It's what?
Okay, there you go.
Oh. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
so it's a debate.
Okay. But see, in Italy, yes. But in Appalachia, I see it on menus. Like at the Grove Park Inn, they have a grit cake with tomato gravy, and there's no meat in it. And when no, I asked. Yeah. So, I don't know.
Here.
You didn't mention peanuts at all, and that's such a southern thing. I had exchange students from Germany. Well, they just didn't eat these things. Also, biscuits they had never eaten, and they loved it. You know?
Yeah. No, I don't talk about peanuts in the book. That's usually associated with more lowland South, like more flatland areas than Appalachia. The nut in Appalachia would be black walnuts. Especially in candies. And that's another one that's one of those rotating meanings. There are lots of memoirs, people talking about being ashamed because their hands were stained from the black walnuts. They're really hard to crack if you've ever tried to crack one. And yeah, they do stain your hands. And now they're so expensive. I saw a jar the other day at the farmer's market. They were like $20 for black walnuts. And the biscuits, yeah, that's huge all over the South and the Mountain South. And it's interesting, too, the bread hierarchy. I write a lot about that in the book. Cornbread is always at the bottom, then biscuits, and then light bread. And then there's yeast breads, and then there's sliced bread, and that whole idea of social stigma and, what's store-bought, what's made at home, et cetera. And all of it's turned over now. Like appetizers, the thing you want is in the cast iron skillet, and maybe it's got rosemary in it.
I think you answered a question for me during your talk, and I want your opinion on it. My husband and I were on Interstate 95 coming into Virginia South, and we're at a rest stop, and we were getting in the car, and these people were climbing all over this bank, pulling what looked to be onions, but they were filling up their car with them. And we're just sitting there watching them thinking, who are these crazy people? But I think they must have been ramps.
Was
Did
it
they
in,
grow just anywhere?
was it in the spring?
Yeah, it was in April.
That probably was. So, word of caution, ramps take 7 years to grow from seed to plant. So if you go dig up a patch of ramps and you dig them all up, you've just decimated that patch. So in national park land, there are dig restrictions, And the Cherokee practice has long, I assume always, but long been not to dig up the root, to cut at the ground level and to use the leaves. You can dehydrate the leaves, you can mix it in with cornmeal and make cornbread. But if you do dig up the root, you shouldn't do it for a lot of them, and don't do it in a restricted place. And the next time you're at a restaurant and they have fresh ramps, ask your server where they got them. You get really interesting answers. And people say things they shouldn't say because they don't know.
You mentioned how the food has gone from coarse to hot, and yet our impressions of the people have not. I'm wondering, there was a phase years ago with the Foxfire books,
Yes.
where people were valuing the skills of the mountain people and the Appalachian people. Do you think those books had any lasting impact on our views of Appalachian people and their skills?
I want to say yes, but my gut reaction is that I think most people in America, when they imagine Appalachian people, don't imagine Foxfire people. They imagine people who are eating trash food. I think, yeah, I wish they had had more of an impact. Yeah.
Coming from an area where we used to have ramps every spring at the local ramp festival and never in a fancy restaurant, what I'm seeing in the Berkeley Springs area is that the next version of the ramps is the pawpaw. Everyone is growing pawpaw, and it's showing up on menus. Any comments?
Pawpaws and persimmons for sure. So at UNC Asheville, we have one pawpaw tree. It is highly guarded. And yeah, it's a thing. And like, if you don't know where it is, no one will tell you because somebody always gets them. If you've never had pawpaws, they are the, only tropical fruit native to North America. And they're these, they're like this big and they're kind of U-shaped. They're green, but when they're ripe, they're kind of brown. And when you cut them open, they're custardy. And you get all kinds of descriptions of what they taste like. Most people say it's like a cross between a mango and a banana. It's like really powerful. I don't know how else to explain it. And they are really popular. They're very fragile. They're very hard to transport. And so they're not easily accessible. So it's one of those things like if you got pawpaws, you got pawpaws. You can pay exorbitant amounts of money to buy pawpaw pulp on Amazon.com if you want to make pawpaw ice cream. And persimmons, too. Now, not the ones that you're going to see at the grocery store. Those are the big, like the Fuyu or the other variety I can't remember at this moment. The ones that grow in Appalachia are much smaller. They're maybe this big. They're pale. And when they're ready to eat, they're already on the ground. They're starting to burst open. They've probably got bugs on them. They taste really gummy, like those orange candies with the sugar on them that are shaped like oranges. But there's so much work to get ready to make something. That's why most of the recipes are like for persimmon pudding, and it's really mostly custard with a little persimmon flavoring. But they're showing up on menus too. Anything that's forageable that used to be a marker of poverty is now trendy. Yeah.
What have you made from your grandmother's cookbook, and
I
how
feel
did
like
it turn
such a
out?
fraud. Everyone is asking me this. And I mean, just some basic things, but nothing like I haven't tried the Blossom, Time Sugar Sparkle thing. I haven't tried the fig pickles, so I've got to get to it. I did make leather breeches. They were really good. They were really good. Do we have time for a very quick story, like really quick? So when I was little, my dad loves food, and he was always making things. And he said, I'm going to make leather breeches. My mother thought this was a horrible idea. She's not into food. She doesn't like ramps, none of that. And he dried them on the driveway on a tarp, and they were not good. But when I got into this work, I I don't think I'll cry. The first pandemic Christmas, we exchanged gifts outside, and we drove up, and my parents are sitting in the driveway outside on Christmas Day, and we exchanged gifts, and then my dad hands me this brown grocery store bag, and it's full of leather breeches that he made. So you have to understand how tedious this is. Every bean is threaded with a needle and thread. So you get a needle like a sewing needle, you thread it with thread, and then you thread each bean. If you have arthritis, like my almost 85-year-old dad does, this is not easy. You hang them and they dry, and then when it's time to cook them, you rehydrate them, and you've got preserved beans that end up tasting mostly fresh. But I used Katie Button's recipe. She runs Karate in Asheville. There's lots of garlic, lots of stuff. And when my parents ate it, my mom was like, "This is really good. This doesn't taste like what we used to eat at all."
Quick comment and a quick question. I'd be very surprised to find ramps on I-95 coming into Virginia, having grown up a little bit. If 81 maybe,
Yeah.
might have been pulling up wild onions. Also, a ramp, as far as I know, is a leek and not an onion. Big deal. How does one preserve or pickle a fig? I never heard of such.
Yeah, I'd have to show you the recipe. I can email it to you if you want to hang out at the end. I've got a picture. One of the journalists I talked to was interested in that too. Yeah, and the ramp, I believe it's the Allium trichoum family. Most people describe them as wild, like in the onion family, but you're right. Yeah, I know. But it's interesting. You can trick the growing cycle. If you are trying to grow them yourself, you do have to have a shady spot. It needs to be really moist. It's usually on the north side of a mountain. If you put them in the deep freeze, you can sort of trick them into thinking winter has happened and speed up the whole 7-year thing. But yeah, I wondered about the 95. But ramps are not only in Appalachia. The word Chicago is actually derived from an indigenous word for ramps. So they're not just in the mountains of Appalachia.
All right, one more question, everyone. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering, are you doing anything to preserve your grandmother's cookbook? Are you going to do anything to keep it in better condition, or are you scanning the information to have it?
I need to figure this out.
Yeah.
I haven't figured it out yet, but it is safe and not being opened and closed a million times right now.
I did say to her before this that I was glad our conservator wasn't here to see the picture on the screen. She may have gotten stressed out about it.
It's a miracle that my mother found it at all. There was so much stuff in that house, and it was in a plastic grocery bag under the kitchen sink. So, yeah.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And we'll have this signing out in the lobby in just a few minutes, so we hope to see you out there.